Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. You know it's got to be a big day when we're diving into Election Day itself.
That's right. And we're not just talking about the candidates or the issues.
Nope. Today, we're getting granular and focusing on something you might not have even thought about before. What time do polls actually open?
Because it's not the same everywhere, is it?
Exactly. And we've got some incredible data from USA Today that breaks down those opening times in all 50 states.
We're going to uncover some fascinating variations and maybe even some surprises along the way.
So let's get right to it. What's the most common time people can start casting their ballots?
Well, looking at the data, it seems like 7 a.m. local time is the go-to for most states.
Okay, so that's our baseline, 7 a.m., but of course we're going deeper. What about the outliers? Who's opening those polls extra early and who's taking a more relaxed approach?
Well, if you're in Connecticut, you better set your alarm clock early because they're kicking things off at 6 a.m. sharp.
Wow, the early bird gets the vote, I guess.
Exactly. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have Vermont, where things are a bit more laid back. They have a unique system with polls opening anywhere between 5 and 10 a.m. local time.
A 5-hour window, that's quite a range.
It is. And it really highlights how each state has its own approach.
Okay, so we've got 6 a.m. on one end and a 5 to 10 a.m. window on the other. But why all this variation in the first place? What's driving these decisions?
It's actually a fascinating mix of factors. State laws, local traditions, even things like population density and time zones all play a role.
Oh, I bet that gets pretty interesting. Can you give us an example of how this plays out in a specific state?
Absolutely. Let's look at Maine. They have this system where larger towns, those with over 500 people, can open their polls between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. But if you're in a smaller town, one with less than 500 people, they have a bit more flexibility. They can choose to open anywhere between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m.
So even within a single state, you can have different polling hours depending on where you live.
Precisely. It's all about adapting to the unique needs of each community.
It's like a giant puzzle where each state has its own set of pieces.
And then you've got states like Nebraska, which are actually split between two time zones.
Oh, right. So how does that work?
Well, the western part of the state, which is in the mountain time zone, their polls open at 7 a.m. But the eastern part, in the central time zone, they have to wait an extra hour. Their polls open at 8 a.m.
So even time zones can impact when people get to vote.
Exactly. It's all connected.
This is so fascinating. We've got time zones, town sizes. It's all starting to make sense now. But I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface here, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
We haven't even touched on how some states have strategically chosen their opening times to align with voter behavior.
Now we're talking strategy. Tell me more.
Well, let's take Arizona, for example. They're known for getting things started pretty early, 6 a.m.
Yeah, why so early? Is it because of the heat?
You got it. It's very likely a key factor. Get people in and out before that desert sun gets too intense.
Smart move.
Then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got New York, where the polls are open until 9 p.m.
The city that never sleeps keeps on voting.
Exactly. It makes sense given their busy urban lifestyle. People might be working late, long commutes.
So we've got Arizona maximizing those early morning votes and New York catering to the night owls. It's almost like each state is playing its own unique game to encourage voter participation.
You could say that. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're not just memorizing times, we're understanding the strategy behind them.
And we're just getting started. It makes you wonder, how does your state's opening time affect your personal voting plan? Can you squeeze it in before work, maybe during your lunch break? Or are you one of those after-dinner voters? We're going to break it all down state by state, so stay tuned.
All right, let's jump into some specific states. How about we start with Indiana? They've got a 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. window for voting.
6 p.m., that's pretty early, isn't it?
Right.
What about people who get off work at 5?
Yeah, that's definitely cutting it close for those folks. No room for error there.
Definitely not. Got to be strategic with your time in Indiana. Now, what about states on the other end of the spectrum? More time to vote after work, maybe?
Oh, yeah. Virginia, for example,
Yeah.
their polls are open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. So you get that extra hour in the evening.
Okay, so a little more breathing room in Virginia. I'm starting to see how these times can really impact a person's ability to vote.
Right. Every hour counts.
Now, you mentioned a few states that open at 6:30 a.m. What about those?
Yes. We've got North Carolina, Ohio, and West Virginia all starting their election day at 6:30.
I mean, it's just a half-hour difference, but I wonder if those extra 30 minutes make a difference for some people.
It's possible, right? Maybe those few extra minutes in the morning can make it easier for someone to fit voting into their busy schedule.
Makes you wonder. Okay, so we've got the super early birds, the 6:30 crew, and then, of course, the 7 a.m. group. Seems like a lot of states go with that 7 a.m. start.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the classic election day start time. Alabama, Alaska, California, Colorado, the list goes on.
Yeah. I guess it just makes sense for a lot of people. Start your day, cast your vote, and then get on with your day.
But even within that 7 a.m. group, I bet there's some variation in closing times, right?
You know it. Some states wrap things up at 7 p.m., while others keep those polls open till 8. So even with the standardized opening, you still got to check those closing times.
No last-minute dashes to the polls. All right, what else have we got? Any other unique times out there?
Oh, we've got some for sure. Take Arkansas, for example. They decided to start things up at 7:30 a.m.
7:30 a.m. That's interesting. Wonder why they went with that.
Yeah, it just goes to show that each state really does have its own way of doing things.
Makes sense. Every state's got to figure out what works best for them. And hey, if 7:30 a.m. gets more Arkansans out to vote, more power to them.
Absolutely. Now, if we're talking about unique times, we can't forget about Idaho and that central time zone part of Nebraska. They're both on the later side, with polls opening at 8 a.m.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about those.
Yeah.
It seems like a later start than a lot of the other states we've talked about. It is. Makes you think about how these times might affect voter turnout. Do later times discourage people from voting, or do they make it easier for certain folks?
That's a great point. So many questions to consider. Okay, so we've got the early risers, the middle of the roaders, and the late bloomers. But there are a few states we haven't touched on yet, right? The ones that don't have one set time across the whole state.
Exactly. States like New Hampshire, Tennessee, and Washington.
Yeah, how does it work in those places? Do they just let each town decide?
Pretty much. It's up to those local jurisdictions to determine their poll opening times.
Yeah.
So it can vary quite a bit within the state.
Wow, that's a lot of variation. If I lived in one of those states, I'd definitely be double checking to make sure I knew exactly when and where to vote.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's always better to be safe than sorry, right?
For sure. But why do you think they do it that way? Why all the local control?
Well, it probably comes down to flexibility and wanting to make sure that voting hours work for each specific community. Some towns might have different needs than others.
Yeah. Okay, so it's all about tailoring the system to fit the community.
Exactly. It's kind of like how Maine adjusts its times based on town size. Different
Yeah.
strokes for different folks.
I like that. It's all about finding the right fit. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen the early birds, the late bloomers, the fixed times, and the flexible approaches. But wait, we're not quite done yet, are we?
You're right. We still have a couple of states that deserve a special shout out. North Dakota and Vermont. They've both decided to ditch the whole fixed time thing altogether and operate within a window instead.
A window? What does that even mean?
So instead of having one set opening time, they have a range of time within which polls can open. For North Dakota, that window is 7 a.m. to 9 a.m.
Oh, so you know it'll be open sometime between 7 and 9, but the exact time might vary depending on where you're voting.
Exactly. And then you have Vermont, which takes this whole window concept to a whole new level. They have a 5-hour window from 5 a.m. to 10 a.m.
A 5-hour window. That's incredible. They really give their towns a lot of freedom, don't they?
They do. It's all about flexibility and letting those local communities decide what works best for them.
It's amazing to see how much variation there is across the country when it comes to something as fundamental as voting.
It really is. And it makes you think, right, what are the implications of all this?
Yeah.
Like, does it affect how many people vote? Are certain systems more fair than others? These are some big questions.
Big questions indeed. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so thought-provoking. We started with a simple question. What time do the polls open? And now look at us.
We've uncovered a whole world of complexity and nuance.
It just goes to show that even the seemingly simplest things can have a much deeper story to tell.
I'm still thinking about those 5-hour windows in Vermont. It's wild.
Right. Talk about flexibility.
It makes you wonder, does giving communities that much control lead to better voter turnout?
That's a great question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. It probably varies depending on the specific community, right? Some might thrive on that flexibility while others might benefit from a more structured approach. Yeah, it's like a puzzle, figuring out what works best for each place. But isn't that kind of the point?
I think so. It's about empowering communities to create systems that work for them. And, you know, when you think about it, this whole deep dive has really highlighted just how diverse those systems are.
Right. From coast to coast, we've seen early birds, night owls, fixed times, flexible windows. It's incredible.
And it all comes back to access, right? Making
Hmm.
sure that every eligible voter has a fair shot at casting their ballot.
Exactly. And I think that's the biggest takeaway for me. There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to poll opening times. What works in one state might not work in another.
Yeah, context is everything.
Yeah.
You got to consider the history, the demographics, the local traditions, all of it.
And that's why it's so important to be informed, right?
Yeah.
Know the rules in your state, check those opening and closing times, and make sure your voice is heard.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It's our civic duty, after all.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our Election Day deep dive.
It's been a fascinating journey, that's for sure.
It really has. We've learned so much about the intricacies of our voting system and uncovered some truly thought-provoking questions along the way.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of these deep dives. We start with a seemingly simple topic and end up with a whole new perspective on the world around us.
So to our listeners out there, keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep those ballots cast. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating deep dive.